Bonsoir à toutes et à tous et bienvenue sur notre deuxième conférence des 5e journées de la psychose organisée par l'AFPL. L'AFPL est l'association des familles ayant un proche atteint de psychose au Luxembourg. Nous sommes une association qui a été créée en 2017, encore toute jeune, mais avec déjà de nombreux projets. Nous sommes tous des bénévoles. Nous ne sommes pas des professionnels de la santé ou de la santé mentale. Nous sommes tous des personnes, toutes des personnes qui avons un proche qui a une forme de psychose. Et nous voulons, par l'intermédiaire de notre association, être une force de proposition envers les autorités, que cela soit les différents ministères concernés. Les ministères concernés sont en l'occurrence le ministère de la Santé, le ministère de la Justice, le ministère de l'Éducation et de la Jeunesse et le ministère de la Sécurité sociale. Ce sont les 4 principaux ministères avec qui nous avons des contacts, que ce soit pour améliorer certaines choses, faire des propositions. Nous avons également de très bons contacts avec le milieu professionnel, aussi bien pour avoir des renseignements sur leur fonctionnement que pour proposer des améliorations. Nous sommes donc maintenant en direct pour cette deuxième soirée. Hier soir, nous avons eu M. Bob Power du SPAD. Ce soir, nous avons une conférence avec le professeur Philippe DELESPAUL, donc de l'université de Maastricht, qui va nous faire une conférence sur la psychose, Reframing Psychosis Towards a Hopeful Future, qui peut se traduire par reformer, réorienter la psychose vers un avenir plein d'espoir. Demain, nous aurons une 3e conférence avec Madame Brigitte Schmitz et jeudi, une autre conférence avec Madame Claret de la Soteria. Pendant toute la durée de la conférence, vos caméras et vos micros seront désactivés, sauf celle du comité de l'AFPL, tout simplement pour que le professeur DELESPAUL ait une conférence plus conviviale et des personnes à qui il parle. Vous pourrez aussi poser des questions par l'intermédiaire du petit bouton qui se trouve en bas de votre écran et qui s'appelle Q&A, Question and Answers, ou bien par le chat. Nous retiendrons les questions les plus pertinentes et nous essayerons d'y répondre à la fin de la conférence. Je vais maintenant donner la parole au professeur DELESPAUL qui va se présenter en quelques mots et ensuite commencer la conférence. Dear Philippe, do you want to start now, please?
Yes, thank you very much for the introduction and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. Je m'excuse que je ne parle pas en français, je comprends assez bien le français, mais je ne me sens pas tout à fait à l'aise pour donner une présentation comme celle-ci en français. Donc, s'il y a des questions en fin de présentation, je pourrai vous comprendre, donc il n'y a pas de problème là. What I want to do with you today is to give you some information about thinking about psychosis and the way to find a hopeful future for this illness that's often been labeled as a very devastating illness. And one of the issues that I wanted to share with you is that some of the problems come from the labeling. And that it doesn't help us very well to find that hopeful future. So let's start and give some background on what we want to share with you, or what I want to share with you. My own background is I'm a clinical psychologist. I've worked for years in the mental health system. I'm a Belgian myself, and I worked in the Netherlands for years in the clinical psychiatry, so in hospital care with people with psychosis, later evolving into ambulatory care and finding alternatives for the services. And at this moment, for the last 5-7 years, I'm not doing clinical work anymore. I just supervise people, and I'm consulting in difficult cases and work on the development of healthcare systems. And that's in the Netherlands and Belgium, also in the foreign Soviet states, and a number of places in the world. So I'm working on that evolution. What I want to do is share with you a number of ideas that are related to our approach of mental health and mental illness. And some of those ideas will not be revolutionary, but we think that just implementing those ideas will revolutionize the way we provide care. So it's not really revolutionary, but it will have a huge impact. Let's start with, and I always think that it's a good way to approach mental health by really understanding what the prevalences are of this kind of illnesses in our society. And I want to share some figures with you to understand what that prevalence is. Let's say that you have a population, as in Luxembourg, of 100% of the whole population, then the lifetime prevalence of mental health issues is 1 out of 2, approximately. So what does that mean? That means basically that 1 person out of 2 in our society will drop out due to mental illness problems in some period in his life. That's a huge number. And the dropout is not a marginal dropout. It often means that people are not able to work for some weeks or some months. So that's compared to a number of other illnesses that are available, this is a very huge impact. If you look at the prevalence in a certain year, this year, for instance, the prevalence of mental health problems is 1 out of 4. So if we would just go with our diagnostic skills and ring at each door in Luxembourg and make a psychiatric assessment at that moment, you will have approximately 1 out of 4 people who would be able to get a diagnosis. This is of course not psychosis, but it's a mental health diagnosis. Also, that's a very huge number, and it quasi automatically shows you that solutions will not come from mental health alone. If you look at what we are able to provide care in the Netherlands, for instance, we provide care to 6% of the population each year. So that's a huge number, but it is no match with the actual needs in society. And if you look at people with a severe mental illness, that's 1/4 of that again, and that's 1.5%. Also, that's a very huge number. If you think about psychosis, that psychosis is often part of, people who are somewhere in care, or people who are in need of care in a current year. Often psychosis is there somewhere. Those figures have intriguing consequences, but because when you think about 1 out of 4 people that in this year have a mental illness, it's almost impossible for us not to be in daily contact with people with mental health issues almost daily. And that's weird if you understand. People are able to manage this kind of relations. They might have some troubles once in a while, but it's kind of part of their daily routine of managing this kind of relations. And then it's very weird to understand that there is an extreme labeling, that we them kind of differentiation that leads to that social stigma that's related to this kind of illness. And it's crucial, I think, that we try to bring those things together again, that people feel empowered, that there's a normal way to go along with people with a psychosis or with a severe mental illness. If we think about psychosis and severe mental illness, we're kind of waiting for the new revolutionary intervention that will solve the problem in the next months or years.
Qui devrait arriver selon nos attentes au cours des mois, voire des années à voir. Et je pense que l'on peut se montrer optimiste, en tout cas par rapport à la façon d'aborder les troubles mentaux.
Mental illness, but I don't expect miracle cures. Basically, it's what it is, la condition humaine. It's part of how we are, basically. And we have to realize that for severe mental illness and for almost none of the mental illnesses, there is a diagnosticum. What do I mean by that? You cannot find something in the brain that is specific for a specific diagnosis. If you take 100 people with schizophrenia and 100 people without schizophrenia and you put them under an MRI scanner, you will find differences. But up till now, we don't know if the difference that we find is a difference of schizophrenia, of the fact that people live under stressful conditions, or the fact that they have not worked for the last 10 years of their life. Because all those things you can also see on the MRI scan. So basically, we don't have a diagnosticum. And so diagnosis is basically a convention at this moment in time. It's a workable convention, but it doesn't really, it's not hard. And that's a problem. Some people wonder if schizophrenia, for instance, really exists. And we understand that when people have this kind of labels, there's a huge heterogeneity. People differ. No one is the same. But also that is part of the condition humaine. Everyone differs. And there are no magical cures. It's frustrating to see that for the last 3 decades, there's no new medication. There's been some new packaged medications, but they are built on the same kind of theories and the same kind of compounds. And even more frustrating is the fact that when we try to design medication based on our strong theories, then all those compounds have failed. So if we designed an optimal medication that matches the hypothesis that we have, it doesn't work.
Que nous émettons, mais en fin de compte, cela ne fonctionne pas. C'est la raison pour laquelle, pour le moment, nous avons une approche assez optimiste finalement du traitement médicamenteux, mais nous nous rendons compte qu'il est nécessaire de creuser les alternatives possibles. Je ne dis pas que ces traitements ne doivent pas être utilisés, mais ce ne sera pas la solution unique. De plus, dans le monde scientifique, nous entendons souvent que la schizophrénie, la psychose, les troubles bipolaires sont d'origine génétique et que 80% de ces diagnostics sont d'origine génétique. Et au cours, les dernières estimations nous disent que le pourcentage tourne plutôt autour de 20 à 30%, donc beaucoup plus bas en termes d'origine génétique de la maladie. Et au cours de l'histoire, nous avons entendu parler de diagnostic
etiology, but that's basically a handful. And a number of them don't even have a cure. So we have, of course, the syphilis psychosis, but that's almost 100 years ago that we diagnosed it and found the cure for that. And then afterwards, we have A.E.G psychosis and encephalitis psychosis, but basically those don't have a real cure. And the result is a high burden. We have a high burden in families, we have a high burden for individuals, we have a high burden for society as a whole. And yeah, no miracle cures. So what can we say about that? Some say maybe we should stop using this kind of diagnosis, especially because the diagnosis has a connotation of detrimental course and a hopeless situation. It has no perspective when you get this kind of diagnosis, and that is not true. Basically, that's ultimately not true. Let's start and approach psychological well-being in a different way. So what is mental suffering? And what I want to do now is just say what we really know. We don't know the genes, we don't know the miracle cures of medications, but there are a number of things that we really know. And those things should be the building blocks of our approach and the way we conduct the care. First rule is that mental suffering is not a classical illness. It's not the same thing as the flu or COVID. It's also not an identity. It's not something that you find in the DSM-5 diagnostic manual and say, I am a schizophrenic. No, it's basically a vulnerability. Or even more neutrally said, it's an attribute of persons. Some people are dreamers. Some people are remunerating a lot and think about those things and become worried about things. Some people are completely involved in and become anxious. And some people are men and some people are women, and some people have a different age, and some people are good in drawing and other people are good in sports. So it's an attribute of persons, basically. And that attribute or that vulnerability is differentially present in the whole population. Everyone has some of this kind of aspects in him or her. And those differences are based on genes, partly, but also on learning histories. And especially the trauma-related learning history is an important one. It plays an important role. And so when you have this kind of underlying vulnerability, it can periodically become a problem. And then at that moment, you really suffer and you experience difficulties, and even normal things don't work anymore. If you are psychotic, you lose almost 1 standard deviation of intelligence. That's a lot. That means that you're not able to do normal things anymore. And that's frustrating. That's frustrating for the person, but that's frustrating for the environment. And as a consequence of what you experience or have experienced in your life, you have this kind of vulnerabilities that play out in your life. Now we have to realize, of course, that experiencing stress, even when it disturbs you severely, is something that's very normal. And it occurs frequently, and everyone has this kind of hiccups in his life. And so optimal care, if you think about that, is not to take away all the possible stresses. It's not to manipulate the genes. It's basically finding ways to increase resilience. And that's a process over time. And ideally, you want to increase resilience as something that's part of the individual himself or herself in his autonomy. So we have to say something about the reason why we use the term illness. And one of the most important issues in the use of illness in psychiatry is that it's basically a metaphor. We use the term illness, or the concept of an illness, to elucidate compassion. If you have a child that destroys things, and you understand that the problem is an autistic vulnerability, basically it generates compassion. And that's the most important reason to have an illness labeling in psychiatry. But in the same way as when your child has a vulnerability of autism, you should not stop educating him and helping him and building resilience. Because if you stop doing that, because you take the diagnosis for something fixed and unchangeable, of course you will have a caricature of the problem afterwards. So that's a very important issue. And basically that's not different for depression and anxiety, for autism, for psychosis, for schizophrenia, bipolar disorder. Everything I say here is basically generic. It's part of how mental health issues work. So if you think about that, the process of care, optimal care, is basically a process. It's not something that you solve at a certain moment in time. You process people with psychosis and you get healthy people out of your treatment process, but it's basically something that evolves over time and that you try to build the resilience that you need to be able to challenge the life events that you get. So developing resilience is basically the concept of recovery. That's what we should try to develop. What we should try to avoid, of course, is that people become more vulnerable. And of course, if people are hopeless, if people who are depressed and stay in their bed the whole time, they will never learn to develop resilience. But of course, they can stay in their bed, but we should be compassionate for the fact that it's not easy for them to change that. That's the whole idea. And so that idea of challenging the way from avoiding vulnerability and increased vulnerability to go into the pathway of building resilience is a very hopeful strategy. And the most important part of that hope is that it's part of normal things. It doesn't rely on miracle cures. It's not something that only works with schizophrenia in a specific type, it works. It almost always has the potential to work. That's an important issue. And so it brings us to the concept of recovery. Recovery has often been described as a winding road. It's a long and winding road. And of course, if you think about treatment in that process of building resilience, optimal treatment should only speed up a little bit of that process, because the other part is as important, basically. If you take shortcuts on the road to recovery, you don't learn anything. So sometimes you have to go that path. You have to take the time of the path. The only thing you can do from a treatment point of view is speed it up a little bit. And that's a frustrating thing, of course, because as parents, for instance, but also as mental health professionals, we want to help. But if that help is a shortcut on learning, people don't learn. They only become dependent of us. So it's important that we realize that process. Thinking about mental health is also thinking about the mental health paradox. And what is the most fundamental part of that mental health paradox? Assuming that you're a doctor and you diagnose a broken leg. The fact that you make that kind of diagnosis leads you to a specific kind of interventions, but basically the patient doesn't change a bit. Also, the environment of the patient doesn't change. And also the doctor doesn't change. But in mental health, if you make the diagnosis of a depression, of schizophrenia, or of autism, everything changes. It's basically a running target. There are no clear interventions, only that long and winding road of building resilience. But the impact for the person, for the family, how we behave in relation to them changes dramatically. And that is potentially iatrogenic. Iatrogenic is a word that we use to say that the mental health care or the medical care creates an addition to the illness. It makes it worse. It's an illness created by the medical. So that's a paradox. We need a diagnosis, or we need a way to detect that there is a problem going on to be able to provide care. But we know that when we do that, we might make it worse. That's an intriguing paradox. And that's part of mental health. And we have to realize that it's part of mental health. So prevention, early detection, all those kind of interventions are part of that paradox. And if you think about that, you can imagine that maybe sometimes you should not do that. Detect people with mental health issues, because it can become, but that's just an exercise, a thinking exercise. If you look at the burden, it's not very helpful. But thinking is something that we should do to understand what's going on. Because if you think about those issues and you detect people, detection can lead to exclusion. But detection can also lead to inclusion, but in a world that maximizes differences. And once again, that's not what you want. What you really want is an inclusion where the aspects of people dilute in the differences between all people. That's the most strong strategy to reduce stigma. Basically, that we aim to normalize diversity. And so the blended diversity is the only way to approach stigma in mental health. And that means that part of our strategies should not be the exclusive specialized care, but should be a public health care. It's normalizing, but being present. Because if normalizing means that people are left on their own, it will not help. So it's not neglect, but it's a present care that is normalizing. So thinking about how to achieve health as a target, what can we say about that? The World Health Organization defined a very modern definition of health almost 70 years ago, and said that health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of a disease or infirmity. And the original definition, of course, of health was not being ill. So the modern definition of the World Health Organization was a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being. But the problem with that is that you take a norm that's not in the reference of individuals. And so I can say, oh, I I like Van Gogh. He's a beautiful painter. I like him. That's my norm. I'm not a Van Gogh. If I try to paint, it doesn't match Van Gogh. So I'm ill of being not Van Gogh. Yeah, that's a weird kind of thing. You don't want to be there because that makes everyone and everything an illness. So people start thinking about that concept and say, hey, maybe we have to do something else. And one of the proposed definitions are that health is the ability to adapt and self-manage in the face of social, physical, and mental, emotional challenge. So basically what you do there is not take an optimal reference, but a personal reference. And the idea is something that you can understand if you one of the things happen if you're 60, 65 in our countries, a lot of people will say, I feel healthy. But they go to their doctor, general practitioner, once in 3 months, and they take 5 or 6 pills each day. So our own reference of health is something different than the potential illness reference of your general practitioner. And that's an intriguing idea. So when people become older, as we all are, and hopefully even after COVID, we will survive and become older, a lot of people have chronic diseases. And the chronic diseases are basically managed. You even prefer them to be managed in a way that you don't have to think about that. If you have a high blood pressure, taking a pill each day takes you only 2 seconds basically, and you don't have to think about your high blood pressure. But your cardiologist can say, of course, there are evidence-based alternatives for that pill. You should stop drinking, stop smoking, you should lose 20 kilograms, and you should jog 3 times in a week. And the comparison is interesting because an antipsychotic doesn't work as a blood pressure reducing pill. It doesn't work that way. But what you have to learn is the same thing as losing weight. Losing weight takes you 7 times 24 hours of thinking about that. It's not a way to forget your illness. It's being constantly aware and monitor yourself to be able to cope and not to become vulnerable. That's an intensive strategy. And basically that intensive strategy has to do with the positive health in somatic health and recovery resilience in mental health. Those concepts are very close to each other. And the concept of lifestyle care is close to that concept. It's an overarching concept that you have in somatic illness and in mental illness. Basically, hopefully it will stop the stigma.
Le soin du style de vie. Donc, c'est le concept qui couvre les deux autres. Donc, si vous pensez à ce concept de la santé positive a un certain nombre de dimensions. Elle est liée aux fonctions du corps, c'est les symptômes physiques, tension artérielle élevée. Alors, c'est lié aussi aux fonctions mentales. Alors, les fonctions physiques, physiologiques et mentales, donc, si vous pensez à atteindre la santé, donc ça implique une réduction de l'intensité des symptômes. Alors, une autre dimension, c'est le fonctionnement quotidien et la participation à la...
You want to create work, having relations, and all these kind of things help you in that field. And there's a dimension of positive personal recovery that is a spiritual dimension, has to do with meaningfulness, has to do with quality of life, and is an individual dimension. There's something very intriguing about that here. And for part, we already said something about that. If you want to reach health, all the domains are interchangeable. So basically, you can think about the treatment of a depression and say, I take an antidepressant, or I take psychotherapy, I follow psychotherapy. That's reducing basically the symptom domain. But you can start with a job, start a new relation, and it will also reduce the symptom domain. It also works with psychosis. It's not a reason to say that it only works with depression, which we sometimes think it's a lower or less severe illness, but it also works in depression. And it also works in psychosis. And if you think about that personal recovery, sometimes people are not depressed anymore because they become grandparents and have a new meaning in life. So it's basically an interchangeable system. And the problem is that the only thing that we do is this. And we say that people are non-responders and they have chronic illnesses and their vulnerability increases. That's not a good thing to do. Basically, what you want to do is to rebalance the system and open up the opportunities of all the domains. That's what you want to do. So if you look at that symptom, participation, and self-realization domain and see what possible interventions are there, yeah, basically you want to reach that symptom reduction, that improvement of social participation and improvement of social personal recovery. And you can think about interventions here. And so if you build that resilience, it's basically a process over time of doing interventions in different kinds of domains and try to avoid to have that diversification here to the vulnerability pathway, where people are more scared and the invalidity increases over time. So basically what you want to is avoid ending there. You want to increase the resilience. And that is something that is part of that process, but it's also part of the chance aspects of your life. You can have the optimal treatment of a depression, but you lose your work after a year and you're not cured anymore. Yeah, but that's the chance occurrences of your life. Those things happen. So we want to find ways to differentiate that care and to be able to find ways how to manage our resources in that pathway. And one of the ways to look at that, and that's a little bit crude way to approach that, is that people who have never had mental health problems or people who have no current mental health problems, you try to find ways in prevention strategies and in the public health strategies that's not indicated as a specific treatment intervention, but it's present, basically. And the other issues, those are the mental health issues that warrant an intervention. And some of them are shadow disorders. I will say a little bit more about those terms in a moment. Basic disorders or severe mental health problems or SMIs. If you think about those shadow disorders are people who are struggling, but that waxing and waning occurs in the natural flow of life. And so you will see that those people are able, with interventions on some of the domains, to gain the gains in the other domains as their personal resilience, but also as part of the natural occurring of events. Those things happen in their own flow. Those people are still vulnerable, but are able to manage often. And sometimes we can think about finding ways to help them anyway. if you think about the basic disorders, interventions are basically nudging in one of the domains and hope that the other domains are able to bounce back because you solve something in one domain. So if you have a psychotherapy for a depression, people are able to regain a job or to fulfill their goals in life. But at the same time, it also works if they start finding a job or start a new relation, the symptoms will reduce and the self-realization restarts. So basically, that's the group of people where you have specific kind of interventions, but possibly on different domains and not only in the mental health domain, that starts up and triggers the resilience of individuals. And then you have people with severe mental illness where you can make interventions on different domains, but it doesn't help. The resilience doesn't trigger with the nudging of interventions in specific domains. And it never works, basically. The intrinsic vulnerability is insufficient. So medication for a psychotic patient will not be enough. You will need to work on the different kind of dimensions in parallel. And that's a concept that we have to find in that non-responding population. That's often the severe mental illness population, that you have to find ways to develop interventions on the different kind of domains in parallel. Not sequential, that's what we often do. We start first in the mental health system with medication and sometimes with psychotherapy, often not even with psychotherapy, but only with medication. And then if that doesn't work, you don't have anything anymore. Or sometimes we will refer them and say, live with that and find a way to find a purpose in life. But that's a secondary sequential strategy. That's not a good way to do, because also the other interventions are not sufficient to trigger. So only the integrated interventions are sufficient to change the balance, the homeostasis in that development now towards resilience. And that's the central issue of recovery. Another way to describe that is that if you have interventions on the different level, only the summative effect of the intervention puts you above the threshold. So you really need those things in addition to each other. That's what you have to find. Let's look at the way we organize care then, and how that sometimes is not very helpful. Most of the people who come into mental health care have a combination of different kinds of problems. And they can be depressed, they have a narcissistic personality disorder, they might have debts, there's stress at work. Basically, that's a conglomerate. And if you always say, if I'm God, I would be able to pick the figures here, that much percentage for different kind of issues, but it doesn't work that way. We don't know how that really works. But that's basically what happens. If most of the people in the Netherlands, in the 7% of people we see in professional care each year, they have an average of 6 to 7 diagnoses. They have a personality problem. They have sometimes psychotic. They have an addiction. They are anxious. They have a lot of diagnoses. And then we think that we need to find a way, and that's what we think that specialized care is, find a way to refer people to the best option. But that's a choice that's basically impossible. But we think that that's the specialist's choice, but that's not the specialist's choice. Because if you look at the most severe people, have the most comorbidity. So in a system where we think that it's a specialist referral system, we basically are only able to treat people with the average severity of problems, because the other people need integrated care on different dimensions. In a system where your specialists are there and the other specialists are there and you don't see them, doesn't work, basically. And that's not only the dimensions within psychiatry or mental health, but it's also the dimensions with the welfare system, it's housing, it's all kinds of issues that play a role here. And the specific referral is basically, disregarding the comorbid problems. And so it accumulates a solution in a one-dimensional situation that will never work. It will only work for the less severe patients, but will never work for the more severe patients, but it's defined as a specialist care. That's a paradoxical situation. So a lot of things that we do is select out the patients for your specialist treatment. I'm a depression specialist, so I select out the person with the depression. That person has a depression and an addiction, not my problem anymore. So you see that when comorbidity comes, the specialist care closes its door, and the severe patients are not helped in this kind of situation. So what is the good metaphor? The good metaphor is the same metaphor as at the operation theater, where all the specialists act together, basically. And that's what you want to do. You want to have all these resources together in a pathway to build that resilience. And where you do that, it's not in the mental hospital, it's basically at home. That's the place where people live their daily life, where the challenges are depths, where the children are, where you have a job or you don't have a job, where you have meaning in life. That's where you should find your work and help. And basically what we should do is that when severity increases, our options should be increased. We should have more options in a situation where severity increases, not the other way around. So that's what we should do. We should develop a system of care where options are increased. But options have to be increased not only in the mental health domain, but also in the well-being domain, also in the domain of meaningfulness with family and friends and this kind of. So making choices at this level improves when also other people are involved in the creativity of choices. That's family, that's friends, that's neighbors, but that's also specialists of the mental health system, but not only them. So that's a very important is. And you see that leads to an idea of transdiagnostic thinking, not a categorical thinking where you say, you are a person with a schizophrenia and we are the specialists of schizophrenia. No, you might have psychotic reactions, you don't trust people, you might hear voices, you're depressed, you have debt, you don't have a roof above your head. That's what happens. So you unpack what's going on and you create a system where resources are available on that level. And basically what we've learned over the years is that psychosis is not different of all other mental health issues. Of course, there are sometimes a little bit more challenges, and sometimes another mental health issue can be solved without the integrated care. But in psychosis, it's almost never so that you can do it without the integrated care. And what we've learned over the years is that a lot of interventions that work for other people also work for people with psychosis. For instance, one of the classics of the last 10, 15 years is trauma treatment. We always thought that psychotherapy and especially trauma psychotherapy is something you never should do with psychotic patients. We know that it works. It works as well as with depressive patients. You only have to start doing it and help as one of the options in the trajectory to build resilience. That's what we have to do. And so what you have to develop is a network of care. And so it's a plea also for collaboration to build that network of care. That's an important issue. And networks are everywhere. People are living in personal networks with father, mother, sister, brother, the family network, but also the extended network or girlfriends, the soccer team, grandmother's friends, and so on. That's the network where people live. And that's an important network because it generates opportunities for resilience. We'll say a little bit about that. And in addition to that, the neighborhood society has a number of other resources. Some of them are mental health resources, some of them are somatic resources, some of them are in the welfare system, some of them are non-professional resources, some of them are professional resources. So that's the network in which you want to operate. That's the network where creativity develops. If I'm a clinical psychologist, I only have a very narrow spectrum of options to help people. In that network, you can increase the options and think about that. How you can, once again, it's a process over time. You don't have to do everything at the same moment in time, but iteratively, you can increase that process to recovery. Thinking about that needs triangulation. Triangulation is the process where you create a form of communication that helps you thinking out of the box. In a dual communication, it's very easy to get a communication that doesn't communicate, that escalates, basically. So you want to triangulate to find ways to communicate. But having a triangle of family, for instance, patient and mental health professionals isn't enough, because you will often see that there are different kind of coalitions going on in this kind of system. And that coalition can be of the patient with his clinician against the family with the doctor against the patient, sometimes the family and the patient against the doctor and the society norms. That doesn't work. What really has to work is that you're able to balance those things out and create a creativity in finding solutions. That's very important in that system. And I added some of the terms that we use to create that kind of collaborative system. It's GYM, resource groups, open dialogues. There are all kinds of models of thinking about that creative solution. And once again, you have to realize that that system is not a care system for the patient. We often think that that's what should be done. If you have this kind of resources, you can help, you can see that the patient helps, the family helps the patient take its medication.
Dear Philippe, can you explain GYM, please?
Yes, I'll. It's almost finished now, so it's yeah. But the important issue is that context creates identity and reciprocity. That creates meaning.
Philippe, sorry, my question was, can you explain GYM, J-I-M?
Yes, it's a Dutch word. It's your personal mentor. It's called. And it's a model that's been used in the Netherlands when younger people are at risk of being placed out of their family because of stress and whatever. And so what they do is ask the person to name a personal mentor. which can be his soccer coach, or it can be a teacher at school, or it can be his grandparent, or it can be, and that person is used to start a triangulation, to balance out a relation that only escalates. Sometimes escalate between family and patient and youngster, sometimes escalate between mental health professionals and youngster, but you find a way to balance that out and to have the trust to go into that process of learning together, because everyone wants to learn, basically. So that reciprocity is an important issue, because if the only situation is that the identified patient is something that has to be cared for, it suffocates him and creates an escalation again. Only if you're able to build that reciprocity, where people can get identity from the meaningful context in which they learn, and that they also get a role in that context, that's an important issue to develop. So just to finish up, a lot of ideas that are building blocks for a modern mental health care that's much more of a normalizing public mental health care than an excluding mental health care, where you only escalated the illness part. And I think it's very important that we build that we find each other as partners in this kind of processes, in which family, but patients and professionals are equal parts. No one has the exclusive right to the good ideas in this kind of process. So that's the last things I wanted to share with you. And of course, I hope there will be some questions left.
Oui. Thank you, dear Professor DELESPAUL. It was a very interesting conference for several reasons. First of all, in Luxembourg, these are aspects that still have to be improved and to be developed. You spoke about some very interesting things. I have written some keywords like psychosis is an attribute, is an aspect of the person. And there is also one very interesting, during 1 hour, you didn't mention one time the word medication. And this is a direction that we AFPL are looking for, and looking for, in a sense, looking for information, how we can inform the people here in Luxembourg that there are other ways than just medication. You also mentioned social network of care. This is also something which is important for our association, the AFPL, because one of our objectives is to break the stigma. I believe, and tell me if I'm wrong, that you can only build a network of care when people are not afraid of the word psychosis, of the word schizophrenia, of the word depression. And for this, it still needs a lot of communication in the outside. I'll let you reply on this.
I think it's a very important issue, and I think that we have to be aware of that. If schizophrenia is only the thing that you see in dramatic films on television, that's not a good way to approach the issue of psychosis and schizophrenia. So normalizing helps, but also one of the huge problems, of course, is that even in my profession as a clinical psychologist, most of the clinical psychologists have been trained to be scared of psychosis, to do everything to avoid a psychosis. And I don't think that's true, and that's not a good thing to do. I think that people cannot build resilience if the only thing that they learn is to avoid. The only way to build resilience is to engage, but in doses, not overwhelming basically, but engage in doses. So that's one of the reasons why I personally and a number of my colleagues also, but definitely not everyone, are a little bit reluctant for early intervention teams in psychosis, because sometimes the framing of that early intervention team in psychosis is, yeah, something dramatic will happen to you if you not take the care that we propose to you. So basically what you do is to build the avoidance. And you communicate to family and patients that something dramatic will occur, which leads to restricted lives, basically, because you don't engage and learn, you don't learn anymore. So finding ways to stay in that engagement and learning, it's very crucial. And people should be able to still have their friends and go to school and all these kind of experiences. Of course, sometimes it's not possible, but the norm should be there. And the norm should be not be to, it's not good for you, sorry for you, but you have a psychosis, so your life is finished. That's not a good way. It's not a fair way to communicate, because it's not true. And so your strategy in intervention should be not to be afraid of psychosis, to engage in the psychosis, to learn people managing psychosis. I've worked for 20 years in closed wards in hospitals, and always worked with the most severe of the psychotic patients. And I never really could be sure that there's nothing there. There was always potential to change, always. And that's a very hopeful idea. But if everyone stops hoping, then the deterioration is the only thing that occurs. That's what happens there. So we have to find clinicians, and sometimes family is more hopeful than clinicians. I think that's also true. And the clinicians react to the one-dimensional approach of medication sometimes as looking for that miracle cure that solves everything. Yeah, that's not good. You have to know that that pathway of recovery is a slowly going pathway. Even for medication, it's true. And one of the things that we do now and work on is to find ways to taper down medication. Because if people stop their medication, they will rebound, and you don't see what's possible with less medication, because you only rebound in this kind of situation. So having courageous professionals and psychiatrists who want to go into that process of titrating down the medication and still remain in communication and still look at what you want and what we want and how that dialogue can occur, then you can learn and you can taper down the medication in a way that it doesn't hamper the activities of people anymore. Because medication is basically, we always present medication as the precision bombardments. We think that we only do that here, and that's the only thing that it works, but it works over the whole body, so you have collateral damage over the whole body. So basically, if you can titrate it down and have that kind of minimal protection that you sometimes need, yeah, that can be very helpful to be able to feel again, to engage again too, and so on. So that's, but you need courageous people, and you need basically to be in communication, because if you're not in communication, you cannot engage in this kind of process. It's impossible.
Thank you, Professor DELESPAUL. You already answered quite some questions that occurred during the conference. I briefly mentioned them. Somebody is asking, is the word illness not meant to be used like it can be cured? And we can answer already, you did already an answer. It's not an illness. It's as I repeat your words, it's an aspect of it's an attribute. It's everybody is a bit psychotic, so to say, and we never. Cannot remember that we used the word illness during this conference, and of course it cannot be cured. It has to be. It's a factor of everybody in the networking, like you mentioned. I will not repeat the conference, which can be a bit of a help. It's the situation which has to be analyzed, and all the little bits to be cured one after the other. There was another remark about can the hospital be the right place? Let me go down a little bit, sorry. Yes, do you think the classical hospital layout is the right place to treat mental health problems? Again, you already answered this question. It's not only the hospital which is the solution, not only medication. You explained very well during the whole conference that it's actually not the solution.
Mm-hmm. I think it's sometimes it's a solution for 1 or 2 days, but it's never a solution for a week or 2 weeks, and it's definitely not a solution for months and years. And once again, the starting idea is, of course, that you don't learn in a hospital. You only learn in your daily life. But of course, you want to manage risks. But also, if you think about, and as family members, you will have seen that also, a mental hospital is not a nice place to be. If you have problems to anticipate the reactions of people in society and even in your own family, because you're psychotic, and you come in an environment where the world is even less predictable, basically, it only generates more anxiety. It's a very atherapeutic way to approach that. And so the only idea is that it's a protective environment, but even there, it's only marginally protective, because a lot of anxiety increases there. And so it sometimes makes things even worse. But if you're in that escalation of controlling and protecting, there's no way to stop, basically. And that's the problem that we have. So of course, yes, we should have less hospitals. Reducing the hospitals, we should find ways to increase the resources in the ambulatory sector and reduce the resources in the clinical sector. We should not have to go to the clinical sector to find a therapist. The therapist should be in the society. And the only thing you can find at a certain moment is kind of a relief if you're anxious and you live alone, and each night the demons comes over you. Yeah, you want to find a way to sleep 1 or 2 nights. And that means maybe that you can have that in hospitals, but maybe even better to have someone sleep in your neighborhood. And that can be a family member, or that can be a professional supporting the family member at home. if you don't have to populate the mental hospital with all the professionals, you have resources to do that in society.
Thank you. I still have two questions from participants, and one is very interesting because it reflects a situation which is quite well known here in Luxembourg, where medication is often used. And I read the question. Due to heavy medication, patients often can't bring up energy levels needed to network or even consider having multi-therapy care. So what could you tell about that?
Yeah, I think the first thing is what I already said. If the communication becomes unidirectional about medication, it atrophies everything else. So opening up is crucial. But of course, medication has the same kind of attributes as hospitalization. If you start with that, it's almost impossible to titrate it down. It's because you're always scared that it becomes worse if you do it, and that starting that experiment is very difficult. So there's a lot of possibilities that you can explore there. Of course, the medication possibility of titrating down in collaboration is an important one that we have explored. But alternatives are to open up that conversation. And open up that conversation helps, for instance, if you include peer patients in the process, for instance, or peer family members in the process, or your own family members in the process, or friends. Or so you build up. So one of the important issues to include peers is that they have shared experiences, basically. So if a doctor says that medication is important, or even that you should not take the medication, it's a different kind of approach than when a peer said that, who had the same kind of process and learned that, and might be a little bit more nuanced, but also in his own recovery process and in the learning of the recovery processes of other people, build that creativity that you need to find alternatives in that process and move away from that unidimensional care strategy. And here also, sometimes I fear that we need a whole new generations of clinicians who are able to manage this kind of processes, because they have been socialized in a different kind of world. Of course, part of what I've said here comes from science, but it's a very personal interpretation of science. It's a lot of my colleagues don't think that way. There's a growing group of people who are thinking that way. So it's not, if 10, 20 years ago, 40 years ago, it was anti-psychiatry if you said this kind of things and you were out, definitely. 20 years ago, it was almost criminal, because you put that destructive idea in people that maybe there is an alternative for medication, and that's too dangerous to explore, basically. But now you see much more people who really think that exploration is worthwhile, that process of recovery and that road that has to lead to learning moments, and that part of the work that we have as a professional is to be able to help that learning works as learning. That's a professional action. If you have a lot of experiences but you never learn because you stop medication, and the next thing that happens is that a doctor or a family comes and gives you a new medication, you never learn. You only are revolting. You only are You don't want to learn, basically. That doesn't work that way. And I think if you describe that, you know that we do the same thing. We wouldn't accept this kind of learning, even with the best intentions, when it's enforced to you. So you have to find a way to have a safe trajectory of learning, but learning and internalizing learning. That's the process that we have to do.
This is very interesting. Actually, you answered my second question about P helpers. Yes, it's a lot of communication. If I come now to the conclusion, it's a lot of communication also, not only between the medicals and the patients, but it's also communication to the network, what you call the network caring people. It's a lot of communications also to do preventive actions. It's public mental health, as you mentioned at the beginning of your conference, but public mental health is also in our case about psychosis, a lot of communication. We have to inform the families, the people, what could be, what is psychosis, explain what the definition is, how to react, because most of the cases, the families react too late when it's already there without knowing what's all about. Mm-hmm. So I leave you the last word, Professor DELESPAUL, and then I will close the session.
Mm-hmm. I think it was very, I really liked to talk with you all and to respond to the questions that there are. Of course, we're on a pathway to a new mental health system. We call it the new mental health system also in the Netherlands. And that's a growing field. And I think it's a good thing that it occurs all over the place and all over the world, basically. And sometimes we are more handicapped when we have an over-organized mental health system than when you have to build it from scratch, because building it from scratch is sometimes easier. And it's more natural to come with this kind of solutions as I have described here when you build it from scratch. What's very important, and you work on that, is to build communities of people who are able to go into the dialogue, who can support each other, who can find words to describe things and communicate with each other in those kind of processes. One of the things that we've done in addition to that public health strategy is to build on an e-community that we've called Psychose net, Psychosis net, and it exists in the Netherlands, in Flanders now. There's an English Psychose net, and of course it would be very helpful if you would help and integrate in this kind of network, because we are finding ways to help people finding answers to their questions and diversifying the options. And that needs a community, basically, community of patients, community of family members, community of professionals. And if we find ways with internet to find each other as we do now, that will be very helpful. So I hope it will have a future that way.
I thank you very much, Professor DELESPAUL, for all these details, all this very interesting information. And again, we contacted you already last year And because of COVID pandemic, we had to cancel the physical conferences last year in March, and we are very happy to that you could have this conference tonight. We contacted you also because you have very innovative I would say innovative concepts for us in Luxembourg, at least, and this is something very interesting we wanted you to explain, and this is something we really have to develop here in Luxembourg. We, AFPL, we have to talk to the right people about things which are be done abroad and which are giving positive results. I also want to thank Marie and Beatrice, who did the online interpretation. I want to thank the committee, which everybody can see on the cameras, which help a lot during all the year to make all these conferences possible. Today, we AFPL wanted to do something this year. We didn't want to cancel anything. We put all our energy to have this conference available. And of course, I thank all the participants tonight which joined the conference on our Zoom, but also I can see on Facebook. Thank you everybody for your interest. There were about 50 people connected, which is for the country like Luxembourg, quite a lot of people which were interested. Thank you, everybody. I wish you a good evening and see you tomorrow for the third conference of the AFPL with Brigitte Schmitz. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.